I suppose I was quite struck on Rita, and as I said, she was a lovely girl. She had been a novice in a nunnery, which would have really upset my grandma, who thought the Catholics and the devil were the same person. That's just the way it was. In Victoria, the divide between Protestants and Catholics was quite strong, whereas in Adelaide, we didn't have any of that at all. It was just never any discussion. But that's just the way it was. But Grandma hated Catholics with a passion, and the Irish just about as much as she hated Catholics. So for me to be going out with an Irish Catholic girl, she was probably turning in her grave. Grandma used to come and visit us in Adelaide quite a lot, but she died just before I ever met. I think I was working at Harris Scarf's by then, but she didn't meet. She certainly didn't meet. Yeah, Dulcie's mum. Dulcie's mum, Nellie Boone. Nellie Boone. Yeah, the communist Nellie Boone. Yeah, yeah. Oh well, that was just the way it was back in those days. Especially, they had a very divisive Catholic Archbishop Mannix in Melbourne, and that didn't help things. And he was pro-conscription during the First World War, which was very divisive and never did. And Australia always was very proud that had a volunteer army. But anyway, that's getting off the point. Rita was keen to get married, let's put it that way, and I was keen to go overseas. I had no idea why I wanted to go overseas, but I always had in my mind that I was going to do an overseas trip. And I had it planned, and so I'd even sold my car. I'd sold the car, and I had a mate, Barry Antonio, whom I'd met when we were in the we used to call it the camp, opposite Dawes Park in the temporary housing. And Barry and I were friends. We went to Goodwood Tech together, and when I moved to Maralinga, I was away, but I met him again when I came back. And Barry would sometimes go out with Rita and I. We'd go somewhere together, and he would drive her home because he'd have his car, he'd drop me into my place and then drive her home. And one night, I'd been talking about going overseas for some time. Maybe that gave Rita the idea that, no, well, this is hopeless, but whatever. One night, I'd gone out with Rita, and she said, has Barry been talking to you? And I said, no, blah, blah, blah. And she told me that he and she were an item, that was all over. And he was supposed to tell me this, but he didn't. And I thought, you gutless wonder. But anyway, I was a bit upset. But on the other hand, I knew that I was going to go overseas. And I think my mother was grateful because she used to call her Princess Thundercloud. Because, I was a family sort of person, and, my brothers, we lived at home. The brothers were part of the life, and their girls, and we'd all go out as, foursome or sixsome. When I was coming down from Woomera, before I ever had a girlfriend, William, who had plenty of girlfriends, used to lend me his spares. And, he'd say, oh, do you want to go out for tea? Well, I'm going out with Janet, who was his wife later, and I'll bring such and such for you. And I'd have a different girl, to, take out to dinner and meet. And when I was home, the phone would always be ringing, and there'd be some girl on the end saying, is that you, William? And I'd say, no, it's Harold. Oh, I'm very disappointed. Yes, he used to play him on a break. But so I had moved to the stage where I was pretty good at this jewellery selling business and doing quite well. And I was the assistant manager of the jewellery department. And then one day they brought in a chap, and his name was Le Measurer. I can't remember what his first name was, but his surname was Le Measurer. And he'd been to all the right schools and just come back from a tour overseas, and he was, it turns out, the son of one of the owners of Harris Scarfs, and I was asked to mentor him and get him into the jewellery game and all this sort of stuff and explain things to him. And I suppose the idea was that he was supposed to learn the ropes at the place and then come into the business. And that was all right with me. I was pretty naive, I suppose. I just showed him everything I knew. We'd go across to the canteen, which was across Grenfell Street, and have lunch together. I treated him just like he was a real person. And anyway, one day I get called into the floor walker's office, which was right up a little flight of stairs on a mezzanine overlooking the ground floor of Harris Scarfs with Bill Congdon, and I was told that I was no longer the assistant manager, I was a senior salesperson, and that this guy, Le Measurer, was going to be the assistant manager. And I was quite disappointed, and I couldn't see any reason why. But anyway, within 2 days, I just carried on like I was before, except that I didn't have my little shiny silver HS badge up here. I wore a red tag like all the other sales staff. And anyway, Le Measurer came out and stepped from behind the counter, and I was, doing the usual walking up and down the aisles waiting for customers to come in. He said, Brownsword, he said, get some sawdust on that floor and sweep it, will you please? And I just looked at him and I said, do it yourself. And anyway, he said, well, I have the authority to... He started lording it over. Anyway, Bill Congdon saw that there was a bit of to-do about to happen. Bill was always a little bit further up the road. He had a little hole in the wall that was his office, and he was usually busy with buying and selling and checking out prices from overseas and all that sort of stuff. And he had a lovely lady who looked after the silverware department and was a real expert in Old English silver. And she was always teaching me stuff about it, and I was always interested, I suppose. Anyway, Bill came down and said, what's up? And Le Measurer says, well, Brownsword won't sweep the floor. And he said, well, his name's Harold. And anyway, he took Le Measurer aside, and then he took me aside and he said, he won't be asking you to sweep the floor anymore, Harold. He said, but if he asks you to do something, do it with grace. And I said, okay. But I just thought that was over the top. If he'd asked me to do something like fix up the jewellery display in the front window, which I was really good at doing, I'd have happily done it, like that was the rules. Anyway, I saw an advertisement in the paper for a jewellery manager to Cox Foyers, which was down the road. So I went down there and promptly got that job, and they were going to pay me £22.10 a week. And I had been getting paid £17.10 and got up to £20 a week in the manager. And when I was demoted, though, I didn't get a cut in pay. It was still the same pay. So that sort of took a bit of the ice off the thing. But anyway, so I went in and told them that I was going to leave, and they then said, "Oh, okay," and back up to the floor walker's office with Bill Congdon, and they said, "Well, we don't want you to go. Cox Foyers is nowhere near as good as us." And I said, "No, it's not, but I'll be managing the whole show, doing all the buying." And I'd been doing a lot of the buying for the jewellery department before Mr. Upstart Lemessurier came in, and I still did it because he still didn't know what to buy and what not to buy, because he didn't have the experience. And anyway, they said, "Well, look, if you stay, we'll pay you £25 a week, and Mr. Lemessurier will be moved upstairs to another department, and you'll get your..." So I got so I went back to Cox Foyers and said, "Thank you very much, but no thanks." But anyway, while that was happening, I was becoming quite an expert on selling Bolivar Accutrons and Rolex watches, and I was good at it too. I learned a lot from Bill, but the guy who was the representative for Bolivar in Adelaide, Dan Frolick, his name was, he used to say to me, you could come and work for us. I mean, he was a bit of a schemer. He knew that they would soon be looking for a new sales manager in Victoria, and he wanted the job as sales manager, and he thought, well, if I had somebody lined up in Adelaide for his job, he would be more likely to get the job. I didn't realise this at the time. As I say, I was only a naive 23, 4, 5-year-old, whatever it was at the time. Anyway, I was talking about going overseas. I'd already spoken to Harris Scarfs, and they said, yes, it'd be great if you went, and, you could go and see some of our people while you're over there and do a bit of learning, and, then you could come back and all this. But Dan said to me, well, that's a good opportunity. You're going to go overseas. You don't need to come back to Harris Scarfs. You can come back and work for me, blah, blah, blah. So he arranged for me to meet their general manager when next time he was in Adelaide, and they had a chat and I had a chat, and obviously I got some sort of a nod. And he said, oh yes, well, talk to us when you get back, the general manager. His name was Robert Walls. Anyway, I then decided it was all time to go. I'd saved up the money, booked a ticket, and off I went. Well, off I was about to go when I heard about a couple of girls who wanted to join the tennis club at St Jude's Tennis Club. St Jude's was where I was going to church and on a regular basis, and I was in the tennis club. I was the secretary of the tennis club, and there were a few people. I could play, but I was never a fantastic player, and most of the time, the only time I got a game, I got lots of games, but in a team was when somebody else was sick or broke their finger or something. And anyway, they brought it up that the fellow who painted the sets at the St Jude's Players had a couple of daughters, and they wanted to play tennis, but they weren't members of the church, and they weren't members of any church, but would it be all right if they joined us? And I said, oh, it doesn't bother me. And anyway, we talked about it, and of course they came. But as it turned out, only one of them came. And she was this very nice-looking girl, very fresh-faced, no makeup, looked like she just stepped out of a country practice or something. And she was a good tennis player, as it turned out, and she was always on the team. And I had a few practice games with her, like you did with all the players. And I thought she was pretty good. And there was another girl there who I thought was interesting too. But anyway, I found myself spending a lot of time in this girl's company. And then one time her dad used to drive her sometimes, or she would drive herself, but for some reason or other she got dropped off at the tennis and needed a lift home. So I took the opportunity to drive her home, and we called in at Dulcie's place on the way home for a cold drink. Mum wasn't there, but my now sister-in-law Pat was there, and she met her. This Chris was either 17, I think she was 17 going on 18. She was about to have her 18th birthday or her 19th. We always argue about which one it was. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we got romantically involved, and yeah, I was pretty struck on her. She was a pretty nice girl, and wasn't a Princess Thundercloud, and we had similar interests. But I had already booked to go overseas, so and I had already sold my car and sold my Cresta to some very good friends, George and Janet Butcher, who had 5 kids, and I took their very old car as a trade-in. And the first time I ever took Christine out somewhere, all the stuffing on the left-hand side of the door had been falling off, because they'd had 5 kids in this car for years and years, and it was an old car. And she said, "What happened here?" And I said, "Oh, that's where the last girl tried to get out." And I think there mightn't have been a handle on that side, on the inside either. Yes, but yeah, the old Mayflower. And I used to, Chris had a very nice car by that time, an Austin A55, or it might have been a 65, who knows. And she lived at Edwardstown, and I used to make it my business to be in the middle of Anzac Highway changing buses or something as she was going to work, so she could stop and give me a lift. But most of the time she didn't see me. She'd just sail past. I'd see her car go, and she'd sail past and I think, oh damn, now I'm going to be late for work. Anyway, but I went overseas. I caught the Orchides from Adelaide, and the idea was I was going to get off in Rome and head through Europe to Berlin to stay with the family. I'd met a German woman who was working at Harris Scarfs in the silverware department, and when she knew I was going overseas, she asked if I'd like to spend some time in Germany with her family, which I did. And so I was in Berlin. But on the way, Chris and I had said we'd write, and I was sending from every port we stopped at. I'd send a letter and postcards to Christine, and I didn't get anything back, and I was beginning to think, oh well, blah blah blah. And then about 3 days before Christmas in Berlin, luckily I'd put the right address on the P&O office line. I was there because I was there on my own during the day in this flat right in the middle of Berlin. I'd go out for walks. They had a big Alsatian dog. I'd take him out for walks, and I got back one day and there was the mailbox, big clattering at the mailbox, and another big clattering, and a big heap of letters came through, as they did most days, but it was a big heap of letters, and I found there were about 12 letters from Christine, so I thought, I'm in love again. It was interesting. So I spent 6 months away. I had a lovely time. It was a big experience, but travelling on your own, it was good because I met lots of people and teamed up with people all along the way. But yeah, I find it much more enjoyable travelling with Chris now that we do it on a regular basis. because you've always got somebody to talk to, and you know, you can say, oh, look at this, and enjoy things together. But yeah, it was a fabulous time. I met some really interesting people from all sorts of walks of life, including a fellow who seemed like he was about 9 foot tall, and he was from Ethiopia. And I met him in Rome, and he taught me a lot about Rome that I didn't know, because Ethiopia had once been occupied by, or a colony of the Italians. So he knew more about Italian history than I did. And so we had a lovely time for about a week. We went out just about every day together. And he could speak Italian as well, which was even more better. So I can't think of his name. But he wasn't very much in favour of Haile Selassie. I'd say he was one of the rebels against Haile Selassie, who had been called the Lion of Judah, was one of his titles as Emperor of Ethiopia. Okay, well, where were we? I was a 26-year-old setting off for Europe on the big adventure. I can't remember the farewells to Christine, but she was always a girl who was pretty quiet and didn't say much from an emotional point of view. She didn't want to commit herself to anything, so, you know, but it was, you know, we were seen as going out together, at least at that stage. And on the first night on the Orchids, I remember everybody was talking about, oh, take seasick pills and everything, but I'd remembered from childhood going on the Westralia that I was a pretty good sailor. So I thought, well, I'll test myself, and after dinner on board the boat, it was getting dark, we were going through the Great Australian Bight, and it wasn't a rough sea, but there were very big swells. So I went right to the back of the ship and stood in the stern, and went right up and down. It was like an elevator going up and down. It was huge. It was a fantastic feeling. I still have it to this day. So I proved to myself, yes, I was a good sailor. We stopped in Perth for a day or two and just did the usual, have a bit of a look around, and then headed off for Colombo in what was then called, what was it called? It was called Colombo. Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. And I can't remember how long that took, probably a week or so, because the whole journey took 4 weeks to get from England to Australia to England in this case. And it was very nice. Colombo was exciting. It was an Asian port, and we went on a tour up to the top of the Sinhalese mountains and saw all the old shrines and things. Then the next stop after that was what the British call Aden, but I now know from teaching a whole lot of Saudi and Arabian students that it's called Aden, just Aden. But so we stopped at Aden. That was like being in a desert again, and I was used to the desert from my days in Maralinga. It was full of British soldiers because it was a protectorate at the time, and there was some sort of a rebellion going on. But it was a free port and very cheap to buy things, but I didn't have spare money to buy anything, so I didn't buy any gizmos or anything. The next stop was either Suez or Port Said, whichever end of the canal that is, the Suez Canal. And while the ship was going through the canal, you could take a tour into Cairo. And so I did that, driving through more miles of desert until we hit Cairo. And Cairo was just fascinating. And when I look back, the opportunities that we had there to see things like Tutankhamun's tomb and his gold casket in the museum, I could walk up and touch the casket. There were only about 6 people in the whole room, and I've got photographs right up close of all of this stuff, and I suppose that's reflected through my journey throughout Europe and England. There were so few tourists at these places. Now you go and there's armies of tourists everywhere. Then you had complete open slather. We rejoined the ship at the end of the canal, Port Said probably, and then off to Naples in Italy, and that's where I was getting off the boat. Now, one of the mistakes I made before I got on that boat, besides not tying Christine up in some sort of legal agreement, was reading the Women's Weekly and listening to what they said about taking what you needed to take on the boat, including a dinner suit in case you had dinner with the captain and things like this. And I thought they weren't thinking about this young fella who was sleeping in a second-class cabin with 5 other people that he didn't know. So I had this big tin trunk, a Valpac, and an overnight bag, a very cherished overnight bag that my grandmother had given me, and with my initials on it. And on the return journey, I sent everything back by ship except for my overnight bag, and I learned to travel like then, and I've managed to keep that going ever since. After Naples, I wandered around, stayed in as cheap a hotel as I could find, and then headed off. I was heading in the direction of Berlin because I was going to stay with a family over Christmas in Berlin. And so I travelled from Naples by train. I remember waking up at the Bâle German station, being awoken by an immigration official, as they had many of in those days, telling me, and I asked him where I was, and he said Bâle German station. And whilst I'd been on the boat, I hadn't shaved. I decided I was going to grow a beard for this trip, and the beard was pretty light. I had a lot of trouble growing a beard. I had trouble growing a moustache until I was, then I was 26. So it took a long time to grow. Anyway, I knew that I had to get off the train in Berlin, of course, and the fascinating thing about the European rail system was you'd hop on the train, as long as you got into a coach marked Berlin, no matter what happened to that train, you would get to Berlin because you stayed in that carriage. If you wandered down the carriage and decided to change seats and you were in a carriage that had Rome written on it, well, in the various shuntings of the train, you would finish up in Rome, not Berlin. So you always had to make sure when you first got on one of these big international trains that you got into the ones marked correctly. And I didn't know this at first, but anyway, you quickly learned these sorts of things. So I went to Berlin, and the train stopped at Berlin Zoo, and I was looking out the window, and there was a young fella standing on the platform, looking anxiously around, and he called to me and he said, "Are you Harold?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Quick, get off the train." Only he didn't say it like that. It was, "Quick, get off the train." And I got off the train because this was Joachim, the boy I was meeting. He was a few years younger than me, but he was the nephew of this woman that I knew in Adelaide. Anyway, we had to get off there because it turns out that the Berlin station was in East Germany. Berlin Zoo was in West Germany, where I was headed. So off we went, and I was taken to this apartment of Aki and his parents, and there was the 2 parents, a dog, and his younger sister, whose name I can't remember, but I stayed with them for a month and practiced my German, which was really interesting because Aki was the only one in the family who could speak English, and he'd learned English at school. It wasn't the world's best English, but it was a lot better than my German. But when I was in Maralingo, I had spent 6 months learning German with an English military officer who had spent a lot of time in Germany. He wasn't English, actually, he was Scottish. And with another fellow we learned a bit of German, enough to, say zwei Tasse Kaffee bitte and all that sort of thing. Anyway, that was handy, but off we went, and it was interesting because being Berlin, being in the 1960s, not everything was rebuilt after the war. There were a lot of big holes in the ground, but it was a fascinating place, of course. Lots of Germans there. And the apartment was quite a nice size, and I was made very, very welcome and stayed there. And that's where I got my first lot of letters from Christine, having thought that she'd given up on any thought of romance and not sent any letters at all. So after a month in Berlin, at which we celebrated Christmas, and of course one other thing I carried with me was my trumpet. So I had a trumpet, a Valpak, an overnight bag and a tin trunk, but I didn't take all that to Germany, luckily. I just took my trumpet and my Valpak and my overnight bag to Berlin. But I had plenty of time to practice my trumpet. I was pretty keen then about music and playing, and before I'd left, Ron Tunks had said to me if I kept up doing as well as I was, he would see me get into the symphony orchestra one day. But the time in Berlin was, really interesting. Going around the city with young people, down the Kurfürstendamm, but the big adventure was going into East Germany. And because it was Christmas, the East German authorities would allow West German families who had families in the East to visit on Boxing Day or a couple of days after Christmas. And the Aki's family had friends, they had family in East Germany, and that was the excuse for going, was they were going to see family. And they had to go through a special checkpoint, and being a Westerner, I had to go through checkpoint Charlie, which was right in the heart of Berlin. And so I went along. I had my passport, overcoat. It was very cold. It was wintertime, snowing over Christmas, white Christmas. And I went to checkpoint Charlie, and they said, "Where are you going?" I told them why I was there. And they said, "Well, what are they doing coming to Berlin?" And I said, "Oh, they're visiting friends and family, Well, that was the big mistake I made. I should never have said the word friends and family, because they weren't allowed to visit friends, only allowed to visit family. So backwards and forwards, and I was kept there for over an hour, waiting, talking, being interviewed by various people. And, I thought, this is crazy, what sort of a world we were living in. We knew that the East Germans were very strict. But anyway, in the end they released me, and I got directions from them of how to get to this station I had to get to. And of course I was an hour and a half late by this time. So anyway, I went down caught the train. I thought, well, I might as well try and get to where I've got to go if I can't find them and I know how to come back. And Aki was at the station, and he had been coming to meet every train in case I was on it. And when I told them the story, they were laughing their heads off, because they weren't with family. They were with these friends. They had family there, but the family was a 5-minute visit before I got there, and then they went off to this friend's place. And it was like Christmas Day all over again. They were having the big time, and in the end they were singing songs and all this, and then in the middle of it the host stood up and said, "Oh, quiet," and he spoke a few words of English, and because I was singing at the top of my voice with everybody else, and he said, "Quiet, the people upstairs, they're 100%. So some of the songs we'd been singing were obviously not very, they were frowned upon by the East German authorities. Getting home again was quite easy in comparison, but I still had to do that journey on my own. The only other thing I remember is being out one night with some of Aki's friends, and he had some lovely looking young girlfriends. And one of them I was quite taken with. She was a very pretty girl. And she had this beautiful Oroton handbag, and I knew what Oroton handbags were, but I wanted to look at them because I hadn't had a chance to see them at that stage. They were just coming into Australia, and Harris scarves didn't have any at that stage. And I wanted to have a good look at it, and I was opening and closing the clasp and all this, thinking, oh, well, I can talk to Bill Congdon when I get back about, getting some of these. And this girl saw me doing this, and she says to me, "Nicht kaputt machen," which means don't break it. But in this very, German being a pretty harsh sounding, like, "Nicht kaputt machen." And I said, "Nicht kaputt machen." Like here I was just looking at it. Anyway, that was one of the few things I remember. Well, that was one of the highlights. There were lots of other things, but yes, well, the trip from Berlin to London was via Paris. That happened by happenstance because Aki had a friend who was living in Paris. It was unusual. He was actually a friend, the son of a friend of his mum and dad's, and one of the people in the partnership was German and the other French, which in those days was, as a result of the Second World War, quite unusual. But anyway, this young lad was attending the Sorbonne in Paris, and so Aki teed it up so that I could be met at the train in Paris by him and spend a couple of nights there. And what I did was I stayed in his little student's residence for 2 nights, and he went and stayed at his parents' place or a friend's place, I'm not sure which. It was all a bit of a rush with the friend. He met me at the station, but he had to rush off and go to university. He took me to his little place, showed me what it was, gave me a key, and it was really a hole in the wall with a bed in it, and a bathroom and toilet at the other end of the hallway. So it was, typical, very student accommodation. But I wandered around Paris, went up Eiffel Tower and all those things that you do in Paris, and had a nice time. And the next time I saw this young student was on the day I left to give him back his keys. And I knew very little French, except when I had to catch a taxi to the railway station, and it was, as we would have said, the Gare de Lyon, but it was but I had learned enough French accent when I was in Paris from this young fellow to know that I got in the taxi and I just said, "Gare de Lyon, s'il vous plaît." And that was the only words of French I knew. Anyway, the driver took me there, and I hopped on the train, and I went to Brussels, which was the next point of getting over to England. I all of the way through, I just got into towns and then wandered around town and found a hotel, cheap hotel to stay. And when I was in Brussels, I just picked the right place. Very nice Belgian couple who spoke excellent English, and I was telling them that I had to catch the ferry across, and they were explaining what had to happen. And I said I was meeting some friends. They were going to meet me at the ferry, and they said, "Oh, what are their names?" And they said, "Are they on the telephone?" And I said, "Yes, but it's an overseas call." And they said, "Oh no, that's easy from here. You can ring them any time you like." And of course, we were used to big distances in Australia, absolutely big distances, and calling people interstate was a big enough thing, let alone calling people in another country. But you forget that it's only 30 English miles across the channel. So they had phone lines, and it wasn't expensive at all. They didn't even charge me for the phone call. So I rang Vic and Georgina and told them where I was, and they said, "All right, well, let us know when you're coming." And while I was there, the people in the hotel suggested I was seeing, as I was so close, I should go to Holland for a few days. And I said, "Yeah, okay, that's a good idea." So I did. And again, I made the mistake of distance because I thought, oh well, I'll go to Amsterdam and then I'll go to The Hague or Den Haag, and then I'll go there. And each night, instead of having to have a hotel, I'll hop on the train and then sleep on the train overnight, and then the next morning we'll get to the town. Well, yeah, I learned a lesson there too, because I hopped on the train. I went to the railway station and said to the guy, well, when do trains leave for Amsterdam? And he said, on the hour, sir, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. And I thought, wow, you know, like in Adelaide, the overland left for Melbourne once every day, and the train to the west left once a week. So anyway, I hopped on the train to Amsterdam, and an hour and a half later we were there, so there was no sleeping on the train. So I got again another cheap hotel in Amsterdam, and it turned out to be a Salvation Army place. I got into bed that night. The bed was icy cold. The sheets were so starched it was like, you know, breaking ice when you got in there. It was fantastic. And I wandered around the town, and one night I was wandering along one of the canals and looking up, and I thought, that looks like a woman standing in the window up there. Oh, and there's another one over there. I wonder what they're doing. And I walked along and I thought, they haven't got very many clothes on. And, you know, I was so bloody naive, I didn't have a clue. This was obviously the red light district, and that's what they do. But it was a fascinating place, and I caught a tour bus around Holland, you know, looking at cheese and all the sorts of things that they do. I met an American guy on the tourist bus who was very pleased to meet an Australian, and he was a bit unusual. He was a really nice guy, and we had a couple of tours together, just talking. He was there for a couple of days on business. He was a fair bit older than I was. But he was saying, I don't like staying in fancy hotels with all the other Americans and hopping on tourist buses full of Americans. So he was doing his alternate thing so he could meet some of the locals. And that was good, but then time to go over to London. I went back to the same hotel in Brussels with those people, rang Vic and Georgina and told them I was on the way over. Vic and Georgina were really friends of Ruben's, but they'd become friends of the family. Vic is an unusual guy, for an Aboriginal fellow from Port Augusta who Ruben had met when he was working at Horde Bagshaw, the big engineering company, and Ruben was starting his apprenticeship and Vic was halfway through his. And Vic and Georgina had got married. On their honeymoon, they had gone to England, and we'd become friends. So the idea was that I was going to stay with them when I got to London, just for a few days, and then take off. But when I got there, two things happened. First, they told me that the landlord wouldn't let them have anybody else in the house without charging a lot extra rent, and he didn't even like that idea of having extra people in the house. Which was, again, so unlike Australia. I mean, you rent the house, and if you have 4 people or 10 people in it, it's nothing to do with the landlord unless you're disturbing the peace or wrecking the joint. But that was the way it was an introduction to the very conservative ways of the Poms. But anyway, I stayed with them for one night and then went and found a B&B not far away. Not a B&B, sorry, what do they call it? A bed sitter. And it really was that. There was a bedroom and a room for a chair, and you shared a little kitchen area with the neighbours who seemed to be watching Coronation Street night and day. They had a little baby. We shared a bathroom. It was an old Victorian house. I think I was on the 2nd floor. And there was a 3rd floor. It had all been divided up into little bed sits and tiny apartments. Anyway, when I was on the way over, Vic and Georgina had spoken to the crowd where they were working, which was called BIG, British Indestructo glass, and they made car windscreens. And they said, you should come along and talk to the personnel manager because they're always looking for staff to work there. And so I did, and they said, yes, you can have a job, and I was working in the office. Now, I haven't got a clue what I did there. I don't think I did very much. I don't even know why they employed me, but it was very interesting, and I got paid £5 a week, which was just about enough to cover the cost of living, paying for your bed sit and food. Food, well, you could call it food. It was what the British called frozen hamburgers. I don't think there was any meat in them. And it was so cold, I could put the frozen hamburgers out, because I didn't have a fridge, I could put my frozen hamburgers out on the windowsill and they stayed frozen all day. And I'd take one in and into the little kitchen, and the young couple next door were pretty good. They had a little baby, and I'd use their fry pans and things like that. We got along quite well. Mostly because I was never there on the weekends. I would go off and start to visit Dave Thomas and his wife Anne, who Dave I'd met in Maralinga, and David Colthorpe, who I also met in Maralinga, and Alastair I'd met in Maralinga, so I went around and visited all those people, but particularly Dave and Anne Thomas, who really gave me a very good time, and I'd go and stay with them just about every weekend. After a while, Vic and Georgina and I decided we'd buy a car between us, and we bought a little Austin A30. And so that used to get parked at Vic and Georgina's place, because they had more room, and we park it at their place. But on the Friday night, I would come down, pick up the car, and drive down through the A40, which you kept heading towards Oxford, but then about halfway along you turned off and went to Cheltenham, and then down to a little village called Ebley near Stroud, where Dave and Anne lived, and they were living in a little place. Anyway, they made me very welcome. I know they spent a lot of their money. They had a little baby at the time, and they would, before I got the car, one of their friends would borrow his father's car, and then the four of us would all go out for the day and leave the baby, sometimes with David's mother, but sometimes we'd take her with us. But we had some great adventures. I took one memorable occasion. I took David with me. Alastair had asked us for dinner. Now, David and Anne came from pretty, I won't say ordinary isn't the right word, but, normal English background, not much money, lived in very ordinary little, what we in Australia we'd call ordinary little houses. And they had this small place right on a road. It was right on the edge of the road, and you'd walk in the front door, and there was down 3 steps into a little living area, and then up another 3 steps to the kitchen and bathroom, and then up a small staircase to 2 rooms at the top of the stairs. When Alastair invited us, I said, I'll bring my friend Dave. And he said, yeah, that's great. He was at Maralinga. So we went to Alastair's place, and when we're driving along with Dave giving directions, he said, hell, Harold, this guy must have money. We were driving through in just outside Cheltenham, and all the houses seemed to have driveways a mile long, and, surrounded by trees and large gardens, and we pulled up to this rather luxurious 2-storey pile, and went in, and we sat at a dining room table, which is a good half a time again as long as the one I'm sitting at now. And his parents gave us a very formal dinner, and it was really interesting because there was David, with his West Country accent, me with my Australian accent, and Alastair with his rather polished accent. But Alastair had a bit of a stutter, so that always made him stand out from from the crowd, but it was interesting. We had a nice night, and off we went. And then soon after that, time came for me to go. I was going to be away for 6 months. I said I'd be away for 6 months, and I had thought that Christine was going to be waiting at the other end and rush into my arms, and that life would take on a new twist. Well, it certainly took on some new twists, but when I left England, I had learned the lesson of the oversized luggage, so I shipped everything back to Australia on the boat, the Orchids. Instead of me being on the Orchids, I cancelled that part of the fare and used that, because I had that part of the fare, I could put all my luggage on the boat, and I had my little overnight bag that my grandmother had given me, and an overcoat that I'd bought to walk around London because it was so damn cold, and it was raining nearly every day I was in London, and it was very cold, and I used to walk to work quite often. And one of the things is, with it being so cold, the dog poop always stays fresh on London streets. So you were dodging dog poop or kicking frozen dog poop into the gutter. It was pretty ordinary. But anyway, the sun didn't shine much at all. So I got on the boat ferry to go across to Europe again. Halfway across, it was so warm I had to take my overcoat off, and I never put it back on again at all during the whole trip, even in Switzerland where it's supposedly cold. So off I went, heading mostly for Switzerland, because I was going to visit the Swiss watch factories, and particularly Bulliver, where they had arranged for me to meet a chap. I rang him, teed it all up, caught trains throughout Europe, but on the way down to Naples, I decided that I should really see Florence or Firenze before I came back, because I'd been reading a book about Michelangelo on the boat, actually, and going over. And it was fascinating to be in Florence, and you'd walk down and you'd see the names of the streets. And I thought, oh, I remember the name of that street in the book. And then you'd do this. It was a fantastic place. The disappointing thing was you were doing most of this on your own, looking at all on your own. And I looked at art galleries just about across the world, I think. But got to, visited Bulliver. That was fascinating. The chap took me out to a very nice lunch. And yeah, it was very pleasant. After the trip from Bern to Florence, and then down to Naples, I arrived at Naples on Anzac Day, which was a big public holiday in Naples, because it's Liberation Day, they call it. It was the day they were liberated from the Germans. So that was an interesting day, seeing them all having a holiday on a day which was similar to ours. I got on board the Orchids and shared the cabin with 4 other people or 5 other people, and I'd learned something else from one of my English friends, who said, when you first get on the boat, then make sure you tip the guy who's going to be well, they call them cabin boys, but the steward. Tip the steward when you get on the boat. Give him money first. Don't wait till the end. And I said, why is that? And they said, because he'll know that you're going to look after him, and you've already looked after him, so he'll look after you. And that was true. Every morning he'd come in and give me a gentle shake before breakfast, and give me a cup of tea and a piece of toast with marmalade on it. And nobody else in the cabin got that treatment. So that was fascinating. I don't remember a great deal about the trip home. Probably because I was on my way home. The only thing that stood out was there were talent shows on the thing, and I played my trumpet with the band, and we also did a dress up, and there were some American girls and an American couple on board who I became very friendly with, and we went to the masquerade night as Cinderella and the Three Sister Uglies, and I was Cinderella, and they went dressed as the Ugly Sisters. So it was, and we won, of course, because it was quite a thing. As I said earlier, on the way home, it was pretty uneventful, other than the things I've described. I don't even remember where we stopped on the way home, other than well, I know we stopped in Perth, and we must have stopped again in Cairo. Well, not in Cairo, but at one of those ports, because some of the people on the boat bought bits and pieces of rock, various stones like citrine and alexandrite that they wanted, and they all wanted me to check that they were all right. And you know, I could look at them, but how can you tell a synthetic from the real one by eye? You can't. You need equipment. But other than that, it was pretty uneventful. We got to Perth, and who should hop on the boat but a jeweller that I knew, a jewellery wholesaler that I knew from Harris Scarf's days. And so we had quite a bit of a chat, and I told him that I may be moving to, that I'd be, moving jobs, or maybe moving jobs, and he was quite interested. And that was it. We arrived in Adelaide. Reuben and Pat came to meet me at the boat, and that was a bit strange because Reuben had already, or I knew from letters that he'd already gone off to do a trip around Australia with a friend, and he had been working in Queensland in the shutdown for the sugar industry, and because Reuben was a boilermaker, but he'd come home to propose to Pat, and so they wanted to meet me at the boat and tell me that that they were engaged. And that was handy because I needed to borrow some money from him. I had no money left, and I needed to borrow some money to tip my steward again. So I borrowed £5 from Reuben to tip the steward. Christine, I don't remember Christine being at the boat, so if I don't remember, that means she probably wasn't there, which was a sort of a disappointment, but not a surprise. And we got home, and I borrowed Reuben's car to take my American friends around on a quick tour of Adelaide while the ship was in port, which was, it was a good way to finish up. Then, in no time at all, Dan Frolick, who had been the representative for Bolivar in Adelaide, and I knew quite well, he'd been in touch, or I'd been in touch with him, told him I was home, and he arranged for me to have an interview with Robert Walls, the managing director of Schaefer Pen Company, who were the agents for Bolivar. And I had an interview at Brighton. Now, I'd grown a beard on the trip, and I went to, because it was a bit bushy by the time I got home, so I went to a local barber in Brighton just to have a beard trim before I met this guy. But the fella made such a mess of it that I got home and I thought, it didn't look good at all. So I shaved it off, which has implications for later in the story. But anyway, I shaved it off and went to the interview, and he said, yes, we've got a job for you, but not here in Adelaide. It was going to be in Melbourne. And did I still want it if it was in Melbourne? So I said, yes, I think I did. I went home, and Mum said, well, you better ring your Auntie Gwen and see if you can arrange some accommodation with her until you can find a place. So I did that, and Auntie Gwen said, yes, fine, come and stay. They had a sleep out the back, which was half full of old furniture, but it still had a double bed in it. And so I went over on the train as usual, having spoken to Christine, of course, in the meantime. And moved in with Auntie Gwen, and in fact never moved out until we got married some many years later actually. But anyway, because I'd moved to Melbourne, that meant there were many trips backwards and forwards to Adelaide to visit one Christine Walk, and I had bought a Volkswagen car in Melbourne. I had to buy a car because the job I had was as a sales rep for Schaefer Boulevard in Melbourne, right in the heart of the city. And I had to have the boot of the Volkswagen had to be specially rigged up with an extra lock and padlock and chain so I could put the samples inside the boot. There were 2 big sample cases full of watches, and then there were other sample cases with pens and all this. It was quite an adventure, and I got used to walking around Melbourne lugging these big cases and cases of samples that nobody knew what was in them. So, and I used to have a favourite spot to drop them with the ABC watch company. Mr. Fema Green was the owner of the little place. It was in Royal Arcade, and he was a very good watchmaker and a very poor watch salesperson. But I used to leave my case there. He was just such a nice guy. He had been a resistance fighter. He was Jewish, and he'd been a resistance fighter in Russia during the war. And he, whenever he talked about his wife and child who'd been killed by the Nazis, he had tears in his eyes. He had married again in Australia and had another child. But I think his first love was his first wife. He was a very interesting but very quiet man, but very helpful and just kind. So I used to visit him on a regular basis when I had a break between, and we'd just go in and chat. And if he ever needed, I gave him the key to my sample case. So if I'd left them under his stairs while I went off and sold, watch bands or pens or whatever I was doing, he had this case, and so if a customer came in, he could show them a sample of all of the very fancy watches, and that meant he didn't have to buy them to keep in his shop, and he would never have sold them even if he did things. It was really interesting. I enjoyed my time at Schaefer. Made some very good sales. Learned a hell of a lot about watches and the watch industry and jewellery and all of those sorts of things. Driving backwards and forwards to Adelaide in the VW and arguing with Christine about the trip she wanted to do, because she'd always wanted to do a trip overseas, and then we said, she'd go for 6 months, and then no, she really needed a year, and I said, well, hang on a second, I was only away 6 months. But anyway, she went off for a year, and so I didn't have to drive backwards and forwards to Adelaide, although I did go back and a couple of times to see my mum, of course, and I'd drop in on Chris's mum to say hello. The first time I met Chris's mum, I thought that she was a real sparkler, she was just come home from a dinner with her girlfriends from Ilford's cameras, Ilford Films, where she'd worked there in processing and production. And she was as bright as a bubble. And I thought, this is going to be terrific. Then I found out later that that was one of the few high spots in her life. The rest of it was mostly low spots. Chris's dad was a sign writer and artist, and he would like to live the lifestyle of an artist, but didn't really want to face up to the responsibilities of being a husband and father and everything else. He was a great raconteur, an interesting person, just not contributed much at all to the household, and wasn't there most of the time. When Christine was away, we wrote backwards and forwards all the time. She had a great time in England, and in during that time, my mother had also gone to England. Mum was an inveterate traveller. I said she should have written a book around the world 5 times on the pension, but that would have been a bestseller, I reckon. But anyway, she had friends everywhere, and that was how she travelled on the cheap. And while she was in England, she and Christine met up a few times. And I really was, if I'd been close by, I would have killed my mother, because at the end of Christine's stay, Dulcie was saying, well, look, I'm going to the United States. Why don't you come with me and I'll introduce you to my friends, and, you know, you can stay and vary with me and that'll be great and everything else. And I thought, God, Dulcie, you know, what are you trying on here? Anyway, cut a long story short, Christine came back. I had bought an engagement ring, and she took one look at it and said, no, not yet. So more driving backwards and forwards to Adelaide. And I mean, I used to leave work at 2 o'clock on a Friday, because Friday was very quiet. You couldn't visit customers in the city. Quiet for the sales people, but not quiet for the shop owners. That was their busy time. So they didn't want to see you on Friday afternoons. So I'd go down to the office, and they all knew I was going home. So they'd say, oh, well, you go off. And I'd leave Melbourne at about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, as soon as I could get away from the office, which was in Heidelberg, and head off. And on other occasions, I just got tired of doing all the driving, so I'd catch the bus. But I stopped doing that because Christine and Francine, her sister, had bought a car between them, and under some weird arrangement, Francine had the car on the weekends. Christine had it during the week because she drove it to work in the city. Francine used to walk to work close by. So Francine had the car on the weekends. So if I was coming home on the bus, Christine had to bargain with her sister to have the use of the car sometimes on the weekends. And I'll never forget the first time I went home on the bus, and Chris picked me up at the bus station and then drove me into the parklands, South Parklands, on the way home, and just pulled over and said, well, I've got something, I've got to tell you this, blah, blah, blah. I've only got the car for this morning to pick you up from the bus because Francine wants it because it's her turn. And I said, oh, well, has she got somewhere to go? Oh, no, she didn't have anywhere to go. It was just her turn to have the car. So that was okay. Either Reuben or William lent me their car to go around, although William had 2 kids at the time, but he gave it up and just lent me the car. And other times we caught the bus. So resumed the life of backwards and forwards to Melbourne until 1969, where we got married by the Reverend Peter Hopton, DFC. He'd been in the RAAF during the Second World War and won the Distinguished Flying Cross. But you would never believe it, he was such a quiet man. But there you go, he'd been a pilot in Beaufighters or one of those sorts of aircraft, and come back to Australia and become a priest. He was a really nice guy. He married us at St Jude's on January the 25th, 1969, when I was approaching my 30th birthday, and Christine was must have been 25, I think. Yeah, about 25. 24 perhaps. Yeah, whatever. Yeah, 24, because that's right, I turned 30 the next year and she turned 25. And whilst we'd been courting, if you like, continuing this long courtship, after she'd come back from a very adventurous trip to the United Kingdom, I took her over to Melbourne one time to look at houses where we could live, and the options were not very great because I had bought the car and done a few other things, and didn't have a lot of cash. I had about $1,000, and Chris had come back with no money at all, of course. And so we were driving around Melbourne looking for houses, and she loved Eltham, which had mud brick houses and all of those sorts of things. That was about the only place she thought she wanted to live, in the middle of the woods, and it was wonderful and everything else. But those houses then were about 15 or 20,000. That they were, sort of really out of our reach houses. Anyway, I was driving her back to the bus on the Monday morning, driving along Station Street in Carlton, and there was a house with a sign out the front, and it said, "Newly renovated house for sale, blah, blah, blah." And I said, well, we could live in somewhere like this area here, because I was thinking that it'd be really good for me. It was close to the city where I worked, blah, blah, blah. And she said, "Oh, these houses, they look so small and cramped." And I said, "Well, look, the door's open at that one, but the agent must be in there." So we walked into this little house and had a look through it, and Chris said, "Oh, they're surprisingly big inside, aren't they? Big rooms, There were 2 big rooms at the front of the house, a small dining room, lounge room, call it what you like, and then another little room that you walk through, and then the kitchen. The disappointing thing was the kitchen that had no benches in it and just an old early cooker gas stove. The toilet was right out the back, and there was a very ramshackle bathroom. But anyway, when Christine expressed some interest, and I said, "You really like something like this?" And she said, "Yes, I could live in something like this," because I'd driven her everywhere, South Melbourne, all over the place. Anyway, she said that, so she got on the bus. I went and saw the agent straight away and found out that the house was available for $3,000. It had been so-called renovated throughout, which meant that it had been painted green walls and pink ceiling in one room, pink walls and green ceiling in the next, all the way through the house. There were 2 power points, or maybe even only one in the whole house, and and the toilet way out the back, which was an old thunderbox thing. I don't even think that was working. I don't know what they thought renovated was. So I went and found out whether I could borrow money, and the banks all said, "No, we'll lend you money for a new house, but not for an old house." And I thought, "Oh, well, that's all over." But I was talking to one of my customers who worked in, it was what they call a law stationer, and he said, "Oh, I'm sure I can help you find some money to pay for it if you've got $1,000 deposit." So I went back to the agent and told him $2,750 or nothing, and he said, "Oh, well, I'm sure they'll take that," which they did. And all of a sudden, I was the owner of a new house. I rode over to Christine and said, "I bought that house," and she was saying, "Wait a minute." Too late, house bought, and that started a renovation project. I had met through my cousin Jean, who I'd been living with, a couple of really nice people. One of them was Gwen. Her name wasn't Haddo then, but it is now Gwen Haddo, and she and Jean were good friends, and Jean's boyfriend at the time, now her husband Jim Carr, they were being a good friend to Gwen, and a lot of the talk was about this boyfriend of hers, and she wasn't too sure. Well, she was sure, but he was in and out of her life and mucking about and everything else. Anyway, I met this guy and we struck up a bit of a friendship, and he'd always been interested in learning to play the trumpet. So I taught Dave Haddo how to play the trumpet, and he said, "Well, how do I pay you?" And I said, "Oh, one of these days you can do me a favour." And he was a plumbing apprentice. And when we bought the house, I knew what favour I wanted from him. I remember, I still think my dad, when he died, I can still see the last time I saw him. And I'd been in to read. What I used to do when I went in to see him is I'd read, and he'd go to sleep, and I'd sit there, and then and then I'd read to him again when he woke up. Well, this time I'd been there for a good couple of hours and read, and he'd go drift off and read, and this time he went into a deep sleep, and I knew I had to go to catch the train or the plane, whatever it was, back to Maralinga. And just as I was about to go, he roused and said, "Oh, read to me some more." And I said, "Dad, I've got to go." And he said, "Oh, okay, son." And as I walked out, it was in one of those old repat wards where there were about 15 people in a row, and I can still see his arm raised, waving goodbye. That's the last time I saw him alive. And I often used to hark back, say, I should have stayed and read to him some more. And, you can't do or undo any of that. That's just life. Life moves on.